Chapter 3. Charlotte, you look nervous as a cat, said Hayward. Charlotte was looking around to see if anyone was watching. She took the bundle he was holding and stuffed it in the wood box behind the kitchen. It's all there, Charlotte. Everything you asked for. The overalls, the cap, the boots, everything. Please be careful, Charlotte. Thanks, Hay. I don't know what I'd do without you. Hayward was ready to leave. His new family was waiting around front. Charlotte tried to look at him, but she couldn't. She looked at the ground. Charlotte, how will I know where to find you? I know where you'll be, she said. I'll find you again, I promise. Anyway, I've got something for you to remember me. Charlotte took a narrow piece of leather out of her apron pocket. But that's your bracelet, said Hayward. No, I cut it in 2 long ways, see? Charlotte held up her wrist. The leather that she had worn since she was a baby was half as wide. She tied the other half around Hayward's wrist. He was quiet and his eyes were wet. He put his arms around her and buried his head against her apron. Charlotte held him and ruffled his hair. She felt sick inside, like she'd swallowed something spoiled. Now get along, they'll be looking for you. Hayward straightened up. Muddy streaks ran down his face. Goodbye, Charlotte, he said, walking backward, still looking at her. Goodbye, Hay. I'll find you. We're going to have a ranch, remember? With a big old sign that says private property, remember? And folks and fowls every spring. She couldn't finish. She choked on the tears as they spilled down her cheeks. She tried to stop, but she couldn't. They just flowed a river down her face until she couldn't see him anymore. Charlotte sat behind the wood box for nearly an hour. She felt achy and empty. Silent, her tears spent, which means like over. She looked out over the pastures and wondered where she'd be tomorrow. It would be easy to stay here and just go about her business. At least she'd know where she'd be sleeping every night. She'd have regular meals, but she wouldn't have the things she loved. What did Vern always say? That the easy way ain't always going to get you anywhere. Mrs. Boyle's voice startled her. Charlotte, do I have to come out there and get the wood myself? You're good for nothing and slow as molasses. Charlotte jumped up and gathered the wood and carried it into the kitchen. She didn't want Mrs. Boyle getting her dander up and poking her nose in the wood box. Not today. When Charlotte walked back into the kitchen and saw the piles of potatoes waiting for her, she realized that as nervous as she was about running away, she was more afraid to stay. Something bigger than peeling potatoes was nagging at her on the inside. But she still needed help to make her plan work. And there was only one person left who she considered her friend. Vern always ate dinner in the kitchen, so afterward, when he came out to the kitchen steps, Charlotte was waiting. Well, Miss Charlotte, I already been missing you, and those horses already missing you too. Charlotte put her finger up to her lips and waved Vern away from the back steps. When they were safely out of Mrs. Boyle's earshot, Charlotte looked at him and gathered her courage. Vern, where would somebody pick up a stage around here? A stage? Well, the southbound picks up in the Concord every Tuesday and Saturday morning. So there's one coming tomorrow. You remember Concord. You rode over there with me to pick up some feed. That's about all I know. Why? What are you up to? How much does it cost? Asked Charlotte. Vern studied her. Well, it costs some dollars to get a body to the next stop, but that ain't very far. You got money for a stage ride, Miss Charlotte? Vern, you know I ain't got no money, but I got to leave. I ain't got no good cause to stay here. The only reason they keep me is to take Mrs. Boyle's place in the kitchen. Worried furrows crinkled up Vern's forehead. Running away is a mighty dangerous thing to do, said Vern. You ran away once, said Charlotte. Vern tilted his head back on his head and looked at her. Yes, I did. I never knew my mama or papa, just like you. I ran from the south to the north, and all I left behind was being somebody's slave. But when I ran, I had folks that helped me and hid me. You're a girl. That's different, said Vern. It ain't that different, said Charlotte. Vern looked at her, then toward the kitchen. Well, maybe you're right. If anybody would wither and die in a kitchen, it's you, he said. She straightened her shoulders and looked at him directly. I'm going, Vern. He shook his head, then lowered his voice to a whisper. Miss Charlotte, anybody know your intentions? No. Almighty, you keep it that way. Vern looked around to see if anyone could hear. Now, you got to make it look like lots of things could have happened to you so folks won't know which way you went. And you need to look different. I already got that figured out. I just bet you do, said Vern. I need a pair of scissors tonight, said Charlotte, and some money for the stage. I could pay you back, not right off, but down the line. I don't know what you have in mind, Miss Charlotte, and it's better I don't, 'cause Mr. Millshark, he'll be asking me about you first thing. I'll try my best to get you those things. You be careful, you hear me? You be real careful. You're heading for Concord, right? So let me think. You know I can't read a scratch, so when you get through the woods and come to the town sign, you pile some rocks up around the base of that sign. That way, next week when I get the feed and I see those rocks, I'll know you made it that far. I'll be worried sick till then. Charlotte smiled at Vern. She would have hugged him too, if she hadn't been worried about Mrs. Boyle walking out of the kitchen any minute. She couldn't let anyone think that Vern might have helped her. Thanks, Vern. I wish I could stay with you and work with the horses, but I'd be in the kitchen and I'd be missing Justice and fretting 'cause I wouldn't get to see Charity's foal or help you, name it. I know, Miss Charlotte, said Vern. You got to do what your heart tells you. I won't ever forget you, said Charlotte. I guess I'm not likely to forget you, Miss Charlotte, and don't you worry about Charity's foal. I got me a name all picked out for that one, and you did help me. Just came to me. A fine name that stands up real good, fitting for the fine horse it will be. That foal's going to be named Charlotte's Pride. Charlotte lay in bed in her clothes until after midnight. She thought about Hayward sleeping in his very own bed in his very own house with his new family. She wondered what that felt like. Knowing you were home, knowing there were people in the very next room who cared about you. Don't forget me, Hay, she whispered into her pillow. When Charlotte was certain that everyone was asleep, she got up and plumped her pillows and laid them in her bed, covering them with the blankets so it looked like she was still sleeping. She crawled out the window and sneaked to the woodbox. Although the night was clear and bright with moonlight, the woodbox was in shadows. Had Vern come through? Charlotte opened the box. Inside was Hayward's bundle of clothes. She strained her eyes in the dim light, and there in the corner was another smaller cloth bundle tied with string. She looked back toward the barn. Thank you, Vern, she thought. She grabbed the two bundles and ran as fast as she could until she was beyond the far pasture. The road to Concord was on the other side of the woods, and she would have to hurry to get there by morning. In the safety of the trees, she unwrapped Vern's bundle. He had put the money in a little leather pouch, and there was a sandwich and the shears that they used to trim the horses' manes. But more than that, the cloth they were wrapped in was a worn piece of a shirt that had been crudely hemmed the size of a large handkerchief or kerchief. One side of the kerchief still had the original buttonholes. Charlotte rubbed it over her cheek. She could still hear Vern saying, "You gotta do what your heart tells you." She found a pool near a fast-moving stream. Then she untied her ribbons, unbraided her hair, and shook it hard. It surrounded her shoulders like a woman's shawl. She leaned over and looked at herself in the water. "Goodbye, Charlotte," she whispered. With a trembling hand, she picked up the scissors and cut off a hank of hair. With every snip, long locks landed in the water and floated downstream in the strong current. She had never cared all that much about her hair, but now she ached for it as it disappeared. She dropped her hair ribbons into the water, and like silky snakes, they drifted away too. When Charlotte stood up, she was surprised at how lightheaded she felt, as if those braids had been holding her fast to the ground. She quickly changed into Hay's clothes and put the sandwich and the money pouch in the big pocket of the overalls. She folded Vern's makeshift kerchief and tucked it into another smaller pocket. She took one last look in the pool. The water reflected the image of a young boy. Quickly, Charlotte stuffed her frock and the scissors in the stump of a dead tree, covering them with damp leaves and brush. She floated her apron in the stream, wrapping the strings around the nearby tree brambles so it wouldn't drift away. Make it look like different things could have happened. If anyone came looking, they'd see her apron and think she had drowned. Charlotte cut through the woods and arrived at the main road to Concord, with the moon still high. She ran until she got tired, then walked, then ran some more. The stage came early, and she reminded herself, but her side had a stitch from running, and she slowed a little. Mrs. Boyle would be fussing when Charlotte didn't show up for breakfast chores on time, but she'd be too busy to come looking for her. Eventually, she'd send one of the boys. He'd see the bed with what looked like Charlotte inside and try to wake her. The boy would report back that Charlotte was missing, and then Mrs. Boyle would be furious. She'd march straight to Mr. Millshark. Charlotte held her side and started running again. She couldn't miss that stage. Chapter 4. Before dawn, Charlotte came upon the wooden sign for Concord. She stopped and gathered some rocks and piled them around the base. She pictured Vern riding into town next week and seeing her signal, nodding his head and smiling to himself. At least, she hoped it would be that way. She still had to get on the stage without getting caught. Charlotte sat on the bench in front of the livery office and ate the sandwich Vern had packed. A sign in the window said southbound coach, 6 a.m. Charlotte figured that with luck, Mrs. Boyle wouldn't know for sure that she was gone until about 7. By that time, she had to be far enough away. When the ticket office opened, she gathered Vern's coins and bought a one-way to Manchester. Charlotte's heart leaped when she heard the pounding hooves. She looked toward the end of the road where it led into town. Then, out of a dust cloud, she saw the horses. Harnessed, 6 handsome, great-limbed horses trotted toward her. They were mostly gray Mustangs, but there was one bay, and a sorrel like freedom. Healthy and well-tended, they seemed eager to work in the traces that wove them together. Behind them, the driver sat atop the stagecoach, holding the reins in perfect control. Charlotte had heard about 6 and 8 horses being hitched at one time, but she had never seen it. What would it feel like to have that many horses step to your call? The driver yelled, "Whoa!" and the horses slowed. There was a jingling and rattling and creaking when the coach settled in front of the hotel. The pressure brakes screeched as the driver secured the wheels. The coach gleamed with varnish in the morning sun. The wheels were painted yellow and printed on the doors were the words U.S. Mail. It was the most beautiful thing that Charlotte had ever seen. She walked over and rubbed her hand across the shiny hickory wood. Then she petted the horse that reminded her too much of freedom. The driver assigned the seats right away. Charlotte climbed aboard and found herself wedged between 2 plump women. "Hello there, young man," said one of the women. Charlotte nodded. "I'm Mrs. Mapes, and this is Mrs. Earhart, my traveling companion." "What's your name?" Charlotte stared blankly at Mrs. Mapes. "My name?" she asked. "Yes, your name, dear." "Charlie," said Charlotte. "My name's Charlie." "Well, Charlie, it's nice to meet you. We're traveling to the end of the line, so I guess we're in for a long ride together." "Yes, ma'am," said Charlotte, and pulled the cap tighter over her head. The stage began rolling and rocking over the countryside. Charlotte watched farms and lush woods moving across the coach window. She wished she could sit up top with the driver so she could see more. Watch him drive the team, ask him about the horses' names. She felt excited as if something new and good was about to happen. What was Hayward doing today? Waking up in his new home. She would have a home someday, but not if she stayed at the orphanage. Millshark and Mrs. Boyle would have seen to that. Now she felt certain that anything was possible. Vern used to say that plants can't breathe and grow in a box that's too tight. Now she knew what he meant. Soon Charlotte fell sound asleep against Mrs. Mapes. She woke up now and then, but with the two ladies droning on with their gossip and the rocking of the stagecoach, she quickly slipped back into her slumber, happy to be traveling farther and farther away from the orphanage. It was hours later when the stage pulled into the end of the line in Worcester, Massachusetts. Why hadn't someone woken Charlotte up and made her get off sooner? She didn't recognize the driver. Drivers must have changed at one of the stops. Maybe he thought she was with the two women. She had fallen asleep against one of them. After the new driver helped the passengers out of the cramped coach, Charlotte stretched and stood in the street, looking up one side and down the other. Guests headed toward the hotel with their satchels and luggage. A burst of laughter erupted from the pub. People came and went from the shops on the street, some in fancier clothes than Charlotte had ever seen. The other passengers drifted away to their destinations, and Charlotte soon found herself alone on the side of the road. What should she do with herself? She'd run away, but she had nowhere to go, really. She didn't know a soul. She had no money except for a few remaining coins. She hadn't thought this far. It was getting dark, and suddenly she felt frightened and lonely. Charlotte went over and stroked the horses. At least they felt familiar. The driver came around and started leading the team toward the livery. "Want some help?" asked Charlotte. The driver began unhitching the team. "No, thanks. I take care of my horses myself, but you're welcome to watch me put them to bed." The driver chuckled. Boys and horses can't seem to keep 'em apart. Charlotte followed him into the stable and watched him take the harnesses off the horses, rub the horses down, and put them in their stalls. "I can cart some water for you," said Charlotte. "Good boy, do it then." Charlotte hauled buckets of water to the stalls, talking to the horses as she went. Then she helped the driver fork in the straw. "You're right handy with them chores," he said. "Yes, sir," said Charlotte. "You live around here?" "No, sir. Well, I just moved to these parts." "Well, get along now. I'll be closing the barn." Charlotte backed away and moved toward the main door, stopping and petting each horse as she went. It was safe here. She looked around and noticed the lofts above her. When the driver disappeared into the tack room to hang up some bridles, Charlotte took a chance. As fast as she could, she climbed up a ladder and flung herself into the loft. She kept her head down and lay there without moving or making a sound. Her heart was pounding as loud as a drum beating. Could the driver hear it too? He was below her now, whistling and finishing his chores. Finally, he walked out and shut the big barn doors for the night. Charlotte peeked over the loft into the stalls. Vern would be fussing a blue streak if he saw how poorly these stalls were kept. She wasn't that tired, but she was hungry. She climbed down and started nosing around the barn. There wasn't a bite of food anywhere. Out of habit, she picked up a rake and started cleaning a stall. Then she straightened the bridles in the tack room. Later, she climbed back into the loft. Her stomach growled and complained, but finally she slept. She dreamed about mush and potatoes and soup. The next morning, Charlotte woke to the sounds of a busy stable. Stock tenders called to one another. Bridles and traces jangled. The stable master barked out orders. Charlotte peered over the edge of the loft and barely moved. She couldn't just climb down and appear. They might throw her out. She listened to the comings and goings for some hours until things settled down. Maybe it was lunchtime. When no one was moving about and all she could hear was the blow and whinnies of the horses, she pushed up the loft window. It opened onto a low roof. She quietly climbed out, shimmied down a wooden support beam, and landed behind the main barn. Hungrier than she could ever remember, she went to the general store and with her remaining money bought some apples. She kept hidden, mainly behind buildings, moving from place to place every hour or so. Before dark, she watched some boys having races in a field. It would have been easy to join them, easy to beat them all, but there were too many questions that Charlotte didn't want to answer. Besides, if Millshark were looking for her, everyone would know about a new kid who could run circles around the rest. After the boys got called home for supper, she stayed hidden until dark settled in. She thought about the home-cooked meals they'd be eating. Several times she took out the kerchief that Vern had made for her and fingered the buttonholes. She wondered at all the places it had been, and all the places it was going. When there was no more activity at the stables, she climbed back in the loft window and quietly waited until the barn was closed for the night. Again, she cleaned the stalls. She wondered how long she could keep doing this. And again, she had trouble sleeping, fitfully tossing in the hayloft with dreams of running and almost being caught. When she woke, someone was standing over her with a pitchfork aimed at her face. The end of chapter 4.